out from October the 7th, and certain things are being set in stone, and we are being told we cannot talk about them. You are a denier, you're a conspiracy theorist.
We can also talk and discuss and have a serious conversation about what actually happened on October 7th, because I don't think that truth has an expiration date. History is made to be revised and analyzed and criticized and scrutinized.
Yeah.
And the fact that you put a limit on what you talk about, this is actually against what this country is all about.
I'm Mehdi Hassan.
I'm Bassem Youssef.
And we're not kidding.
No, we're not.
As a Teo podcast.
We're not kidding. Because the rest of the media is. Because the rest of the media is full of nonsense.
Bassem's excited today. Bassem,
I am
good to see you. It's been a few weeks.
Very.
Good to be back in person with you here in LA again.
Yes.
I'm on the West Coast.
Thank you.
This is the podcast where funny people talk about serious things, but also funny things. Today,
Also, serious people talk about ridiculous things, which we have been seeing in the media.
I'm the serious person. You're
Well,
the funny
I
person.
think in that case, I think the rest of the media is very clownish, and we need to discuss very, very serious issue today.
It's a very serious issue, and wherever I go, people say we don't talk about October the 7th enough.
So today we're talking about October 7th.
And we're going to talk about some of the issues that we've had with the discourse around October the 7th. We are now nearly 9 months out from October the 7th. You and I have done a lot of media, I think it's fair to say, since the 7th of October. Me, when I was at MSNBC, since leaving MSNBC, I've done a ton of interviews, podcasts, did a debate recently, didn't go so well. You have done more podcasts than I have had hot meals, and I eat a lot of hot meals. I've seen you argue with people on multiple continents about October the 7th.
And the one thing that they tell me is like, why don't we speak about the hostages? So today, I want to speak about the hostages.
Okay.
I want to speak about what the terrible things that happened to the Israeli citizens and civilians on that day on October 7th.
So I do want to do a bit of it. I do want us to do a bit of a debunking of some certain stuff. Sensitive topics.
Yes.
Right? Sensitive topics. I want to talk about civilian casualties. I want us to talk about some of the awful things that were said that turned out to be untrue regarding babies, for example. We're also going to talk about sexual violence, which is a topic people try and avoid because it is so sensitive and explosive and controversial, and you get shouted at. We've got a great guest who's going to help walk us through this topic.
We have an expert.
An expert, a true expert. And that word is thrown around. Azadeh Moaveni. She's a journalist, a war correspondent, a professor of journalism, and she ran the gender program at the International Crisis Group. She's written very eloquently and passionately and informatively on this subject.
So she's an expert and she knows what she's talking about.
There is a lot of stuff that's been said, some true, some not true, and some just unproven that we may never know. And what bothers me is that we are months and months out from October the 7th, and certain things are being set in stone, and we are being told we cannot talk about them. You are a denier, you're a conspiracy theorist. And I just want to be clear, I am not one of these people who denies what happened on October 7th. I'm going to put my cards on the table. From day one, I was horrified by what happened on October 7th.
Yes, but we can also talk and discuss and have a serious conversation about what actually happened on October 7th, because I don't think that truth has an expiration date. It's not like, oh, after 3 months you can not talk about it any day. History is made to be revised and analyzed and criticized and scrutinized.
Yeah.
And the fact that you put a limit on what you talk about, this is actually against what this country is all about.
It's actually what leads to conspiracy theories,
Yeah.
right? 9/11.
If you tell people you cannot talk about it, people will just like come up with
9/11 conspiracy theories. I remember 9/11, how conspiracies spread, including in the Muslim community, hugely. And that was partly because George Bush, Dick Cheney did try and cover up their own idiocy and ignorance and incompetence and their weaponizing of the tragedy
But
for their own military
let's
goals.
talk about Israel 9/11. Let's talk about October 7th. What happened on that?
And I just want to say something very clearly, because I have these arguments with, I don't know, you agree, disagree, no comment. My position on October 7th is what Hamas did was horrific. What I saw was horrific. It is one of the great crimes of recent years. It is, I will use the T word, people might not like it. These are acts of terror. They terrorized the people in Israel. They didn't just kill soldiers. They killed civilians. And I'm going to be talking a lot today about...
It's a terrible act of terror in retaliation of acts of terror that Israel has been doing all over 3 years, of course.
There's no debate that the world didn't begin on October the 7th. We both agree on that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be leaning heavily on the conclusions, Bassem, today of the UN Commission of Inquiry report that just came out that the Israelis hate.
But Israel doesn't care about the UN.
But I do. So the UN Commission is very, very fair. It does call out Israeli war crimes. It calls out Hamas war crimes. It makes clear that both sides deliberately killed people. And on October the 7th, they didn't just kill soldiers. They killed civilians. And that's a war crime. They took children hostage. That is a war crime. And what amazes me and why I want to talk about this episode today is October the 7th was bad enough in and of itself without what some on the pro-Israeli side did to weaponize it, to justify their own atrocity since, their own genocide in Gaza since. And as you say, the idea that you just suppress talking about events and that we're not as journalists, as writers, artists, able to talk about the horrors of that day because they're closed off, I think is absurd. So I'm glad that you wanted to talk about this subject.
I was on this podcast with this like Adam Sosnick guy, or the PBD, the guy who, when I told him like, listen, there's something called the Hannibal Directive. I was like, what is this? What's the Hannibal Directive? It's like basically what happened is that the Israeli military went in and they have killed unintentionally, indiscriminately, a lot of folks. Like, oh, are you telling me that the Israelis are killing their own? That's ridiculous. Like, look it up.
So Hannibal has been on my mind a lot recently.
Yeah, and because when I said it's like, what? Do you mean Hannibal Lecter?
So it's funny
because here's the thing. Why? And it's like, oh, that's very, very, very interesting because why save anybody where you can eat everybody? It's
so
like it's an open buffet for killing.
It's funny that you say Hannibal Lecter because Donald Trump...
I didn't come here to save. I came here to
Did you see the Donald Trump rally a few weeks ago?
No.
Where he praised Hannibal Lecter?
Oh, interesting.
No joke. Donald Trump, former president of the United States, wants to be president again. He praised Hannibal Lecter as an amazing guy, as if he's still alive. The guy's a cannibal and a serial killer. But it's funny that Hannibal...
I have an explanation. Maybe he heard that Hannibal is something that Israel does, and as we know, Trump loves everything that Israel does. So without even knowing, it's like, Hannibal is a great guy. Who is it? Oh, he eats people.
So the Hannibal Directive. We're going to start the show today talking about the Hannibal.
Who's
Directive.
Hannibal?
So Hannibal is not Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general in the second century.
From Carthage. From Carthage. So, okay.
And he fought with the Romans, famously took his army across the mountains. But what a lot of people don't know is that when the Romans had him surrounded, they were coming for him. He did not want to become a Roman prisoner and he poisoned himself to death. He committed suicide. By the way, the Israeli commanders in Lebanon, in the 1980s, a couple of Israeli commanders come up with this doctrine called the Hannibal Directive. Hezbollah takes Israeli soldiers hostage. And the Israeli commanders come up with a plan to say, if Hezbollah is going to take our soldiers hostage, we don't want them hostage. We get them back at all costs. They say they didn't name it after Hannibal, the Carthaginian general.
So maybe they did name him after Hannibal Lecter.
So let me just read
I was right. It's a buffet for killing.
Although, was Hannibal Lecter around in the 80s? I don't even know. My history and fiction is now merging into one.
Silence of the Lambs, man.
I'm going to read it out to you. During an abduction, this was the doctrine as originally passed in the 80s. During an abduction, the major mission is to rescue our soldiers from the abductors, even at the price of harming or wounding our soldiers. Light arms fire is to be used in order to bring the abductors to the ground or to stop them. In any event, everything will be done to stop the vehicle and not allow it to escape.
As a matter of fact, there is a soldier who's quoted saying, like, well, I saw them like running away, so I thought like instead of them falling into captivity, I thought to kill them. That's exactly what happened on October 7th.
So before we get to October 7th itself, they have this doctrine. It's the 1980s. It's very controversial. They've never published the full text of it. 2016, after they carry it out in Gaza, do you remember the 2014 Gaza war that we've just memory hold all the previous assaults on Gaza? Towards the end of that, an Israeli soldier was taken hostage by Hamas, taken into Gaza. The Israelis went in and killed hundreds of people, according to Amnesty International, as part of the Hannibal Directive, openly using it. After that, they rescinded it. 2016, it was officially revoked. And yet on October the 7th, we now know, according to the UN report, which came out last week, the UN says the Hannibal Directive was used on October 7th. Bassem, break down for us. You've been following this very closely over the last few months. What kind of things did the Israelis do on October 7th, which led to the deaths of their own civilians? Because remember, 1,400 is the death toll, right? It's then lowered to 1,200. Of the 1,200, 700, I believe, are civilians.
739.
And some of those civilians, we don't know how many because the Israelis weren't doing independent
investigation.
Some of them were killed by Israel.
Here's interesting. Like, okay, I know there's a lot of information about this, but the fact that, like, as I said, like one of the soldiers said, like, I saw a vehicle running away with the hostages, so I thought of like shooting them and killing them instead of them falling in captivity. And then I thought, it was like, this is a very, very efficient soldier. So he would think, it's like, wait, if they are dead, there are no hostages. And if there's no hostages, there's no need for an extra rescue mission, so I don't need to go to another shift. This is how effective. So basically, he's cutting down his work from the source. If there's no hostages, no, basically, this is Israel. When Israel tells you, we do not negotiate with terrorists, So their idea of not negotiating is eliminating the negotiation by eliminating the hostages in the first place. If there's no hostages, there's nothing to negotiate
So it's
about.
interesting you should mention that, because the incident that the UN talks about in its report, which a lot of media have covered over the months, mainstream American, by the way, American British media has not covered any of this stuff. Israeli media has covered it.
Yeah.
Bloggers and activists, especially on the pro-Palestinian side, have covered it. Our media here in the United States, completely silent.
You know what does it sound like? You know, like people like doing bro language. It's like, hey, I'm with my girlfriend and I need you to verify everything, and your bro will lie for you. Like America is Israel's bro. It is lying for Israel on behalf of Israel. And Israel's like, I think you're going too much.
Even the Israelis are talking.
The Israeli
I
media.
always find it fascinating.
The Israeli media have talked about the Hannibal Directive many times on the media. They even had a girl, her name is Yasmin Burat. She's one of the hostages. She was locked in a house where 40 terrorists were locking in 14 hostages. And they said we were shot and we had like Israeli tanks firing on us, killing everybody. And she came on a podcast and said that. And the American and the British media, nothing.
No.
This is the best bro cover-up I've ever seen in my life.
So what's interesting, Bassem, is, and why I think we need to talk about on this show today, is you have the UN report comes out. It says the Hannibal Directive was applied. It refers to the Yasmin Porat incident in Kibbutz Be'eri, where Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other fighters carried out some of the worst atrocities. They took hostages into a house and they said they want to negotiate to get out. The Israelis, a general turns up called Barak Hiram, I think his name is, and he's a settler, by the way. Some of the generals on the day were hardcore messianic Israeli soldiers.
Barak what?
Hiram, I think.
Haram.
My pronunciation's horrible. I apologize to my Israeli
friends. So he
friends
did
if I'm
something
getting...
that's totally haram.
Oh my
and
God.
he would go in
Oh
and
my
you
God.
kill
Boom,
everyone.
boom, boom.
Listen, Mehdi, listen, I know that you're very happy with your facts.
I am.
I don't care.
Okay.
I don't care because this is bullshit. I'm done. No, I'm done. I'm done even trying to make sense of all of this. The fact that the Israeli military shows up and kill everybody is like when your house catches fire and the fire department shows with flamethrowers. This is like how ridiculous it is. It's like I imagine someone like Yasmin Brad sitting there's like, oh, the military are here for the hostages. Now we're here for collateral damage. This is how bad it is.
And I just want to be clear, Bassem, just to back you up, the general who turns up gives the order to say, and this is reported in the media, he says, go in, shoot, even if civilians die, right? This is his order. And some other Israeli soldiers who were on the ground have told Haaretz and other Israeli media that they were shocked at that order. And 13, by the way, the families of the people who died in Kibbutz Be'eri have complained to the Israeli government. They've demanded an investigation. One was done quickly, which cleared the general and cleared the colonel.
Did they give the general 1 star?
They cleared him.
Did they give them
You'll
1
be
star?
shocked to
There's
hear.
like what kind of did they give their evaluation for the service? Like, can you imagine anywhere in the world, like your military service, like, thank you for your service, thank you for your service, except in Israel, thank you for your service. Your service is not. We were better off before you guys showed up. This is how bad. And here's the thing. Here's what I'm interesting. It's kind of like Israel is so jealous that Hamas killed more civilians on that day than they would normally do on one day. Like Israel's like, no one get to kill civilians other than us. It's kind of like there's like the day will not end until our body count is higher than yours. So we gotta go in and finish the job. This is how it's like. Why is Israel's first response about everything is killing civilians?
Yeah, that day...
You go into Gaza, we kill civilians.
Well,
we go in to save our own people, we kill civilians.
But what's interesting is the Hannibal Directive itself, and again, I want to make this clear because people will say you're being unfair to the Israeli military. They were trying to save lives. It was a chaotic day. Hold on. It was a chaotic day.
Yeah,
right?
Of course. Yeah,
Hamas have breached their defenses. It's the biggest Israeli security failure in history.
The
fact that Hamas are even there. They're going into a place like Kibbutz Be'eri where hostages are held. And they are, I just want to quote. So there's a guy called Asa Kasher, who's a philosopher, Bassem. He's the guy who came up with the IDF's Code of Ethics. What's that? Code of Ethics. They actually have one.
That's the biggest geopolitical oxymoron I've ever heard in my life. IDF Code of Ethics.
And even he says that, the Hannibal Directive did exist. The original order does not allow for you to kill an Israeli citizen. So he's saying he wants an investigation too. Even he thinks what happens on October 7th.
How dare you kill Israeli civilians instead
of Palestinians? The IDF is only for killing Palestinian civilians. Get it right? I mean, Bassem, there are so many examples that just haven't really been covered in the West. They have been covered in Israeli media and in some left websites of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. In a statement given to an Israeli news channel, a tank driver and a commander said they targeted 2 Toyota vehicles with militants and Israeli civilians inside of them. He said, I prefer stopping the abduction, so they won't be taken. I prefer killing them to stopping them from being hostages and released freely.
I said, like, he's trying to save one more shift.
Captain Bar Zonshine says that he fired tank shells at vehicles driving towards Gaza. He said, I decided it's the right decision. It's better to stop the abduction.
I feel late dinners, walking on beach and firing at vehicles.
I feel that I acted correctly, he says. And then Colonel Nof Erez.
I think the hostage was like his cousin and he hated them.
Yeah, there's some personal beef. Yeah. Colonel Nof Erez says it was, don't take our words for it, the 2 brown dudes. He says it was a mass Hannibal event on 7th of October. A mass Hannibal event. Lots of shooting going on. And look, anyone can read the UN report for themselves. They lay out the examples we talked about. Who cares about
UN?
We talked about the kibbutz berry, yeah. Well,
nobody cares.
They don't care, but care. Some of us care.
Listen, I mean, Israel has always been playing like international limbo. It's like when international is like how low can we get? It's like, not low enough. This is how low they get. They always go low. I mean, Israel interpretation over international law is my daughter's interpretation over bedtime. It works when it suits her.
Yep.
So it's just like, it really doesn't matter anymore.
And I interviewed Mark Regev, Bassem, you may remember, a few months ago. And he said that they had lowered the death toll from 1,400 to 12. It was the first time the Israeli government admitted this, because 200 Hamas fighters were mixed in with the civilian counts. They realized those burned bodies were Hamas fighters. And the question at the time was, well, who burned the Hamas fighters? They didn't burn themselves. And if 200 Hamas bodies were killed by Israel, how do we know how many other bodies were killed by Israel? And again, I'm not saying that Israel killed most or all of the people on October 7th. I just want to be clear before it's clipped out of context. I'm saying Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and those groups created the scenario, created the conditions.
When those people, their only answer is only kill civilians. I mean, when they go to Gaza and they kill civilians, it's collateral damage. When they do it to their own people, that's not collateral. That's not collateral damage. That's just damage. Yeah. That's what they do. They just damage. They go in and they kill, and they have absolutely, and then they go in and they cry and they victimize themselves about how many hostages and how many people were killed. And there's absolutely, if I was an Israeli father, I would like to know who killed my son.
And they have. And Hadass Dagan is one of the people who survived that attack on the house in Kibbutz Be'eri. And she wants answers. A lot of people want answers. What went on?
I mean, who wants answer when everybody can be called anti-Semite?
But what's interesting is these are Israelis, by the way, Israeli Jews who want answers. But the Israeli government keeps saying we're going to do a full investigation after the war is over. Yeah. Could that be why the war is never over? Could that be why it keeps dragging out? Because Benjamin Netanyahu knows he needs to have an investigation. What annoys me, Bassem, as a journalist, is I don't expect the Israeli government to do an investigation, but I do expect media organizations to do an investigation. Since the UN put out their report last week where they confirmed the Hannibal Directive was used, they identified people who were killed, they identified cars that were attacked. Do you know how many British or American newspapers or news organizations have covered the Hannibal Directive?
0.
One.
Who?
The Telegraph, the right-wing newspaper in the UK.
Does anybody
but
read
they did it in a way that criticized the idea that you would say this. So there's no coverage of Hannibal. No coverage of what might have happened on October 7th. You would think that if it is the biggest terrorist attack, the 9/11 of our time, you would think there would be a lot of media coverage of what actually happened on the day, and there isn't, right? You and I have to sit on a podcast and tell people...
Why don't we talk about October 7th the way that we want you to talk about?
Exactly. Let's talk about October. Let's talk exactly. So let's talk about also what came out of October the 7th.
No, I'm so sorry. I have to stop you here first.
Go on.
Let's talk about the response of the IDF. Let's talk because Israel is a country that is funded by the United States, and it's funded to keep security and to protect its people. Let's talk about the response of the IDF. It took 6 hours for IDF forces to come and reach the kibbutz. 6 hours. Israel, for people who don't know, is as small as New Jersey. It is that small and it's that horrible. It's as small as New Jersey, right? And in that small area, they have more military bases and more airfields than America has Starbucks, and it is everywhere. The response time in a place like this that is heavily populated with military bases should be less than 5 minutes. It took them 6 hours. 6 hours. Did they stop to ask for directions? Well, I mean, were they using an old Garmin GPS? What the hell? Were they following the North Star and get lost? How can it take... I could have watched the last season of Succession in those 6 hours. 6 hours to reach, and we are supposed to pay for that kind of service?
By the way...
I mean, I'm fine. I mean, kill all Palestinians. I don't care. Kill everybody. But at least if I'm paying for a service, for a military, they should just come up. with like a better service.
You said that, did they stop for directions? Maybe they were using Waze, which is founded
No,
by an
even
Israeli.
Waze will
Founded
get
by
you
an Israeli.
faster.
Founded by
No,
an
no,
Israeli.
no. Waze, yes, but even Waze will say to you like, it's like even Waze will say like, I think you're too slow.
One day we will find out why it took so long. But as I say, the Israelis are not interested in investigation. The Israeli media is asking questions, and the Western media is absent. And so we're sitting on a podcast in Los Angeles in 2024, in June of 2024. We're sitting in LA doing a podcast called We're Not Kidding, and we're having to talk about stuff that's in a UN report, but it's not in any of our media organizations.
Maybe in California I can understand why they took so long. You know?
Go on.
No, because they took the scenic route.
I think it was because of LA traffic.
They took the scenic route. No, they took the scenic. No, when you can go from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 5 hours or in 7 hours. It depends on like what route
Which
you
route?
get.
So
If you get the scenic route,
The tanks were taking the scenic route.
Yeah.
So we talked about, we want to talk about October 7th, as you very well put it, only the way we want to talk about it. So we're talking about civilian casualties in a way that a lot of people don't want to hear about it. Yes, Hamas is responsible for putting those people in danger. I'm not going to dispute that. But the Israeli military, we don't know how many people they killed on the day. We know they killed some. We know that Israeli families are upset about it, and we know that the media doesn't cover it. Then we have the fallout from October 7th, where we're hearing about the atrocities. Horrible things have happened, and yet for some reason, I can't imagine why, Israeli military, Israeli officials, some journalists, and the American government decide to make shit up.
I would in my mind, it will always live the testimony of Antony Blinken, the highest ranking U.S. official in front of Congress, when he described this scene about a group of Hamas terrorists went in, raped the woman, cut off her breast, gouged the eyes of the father, amputated the limb of the daughter, and cut off the finger of the little child, and then they sat down having breakfast. Who have the luxury to do that in a war zone? And also, where's the IDF during all of that? So we are supposed to believe that actually happened. No, that
was debunked.
That is the story that actually primed the world to accept and turn a blind eye for the horrible killing of it. But I have a few questions. First of all, that guy, Antony Blinken, never apologized for that.
Nope.
This was actually refuted many times, even by the Israeli media themselves.
Yep.
And he never took it back. And also, as a doctor, you know how hard it is to cut into breast tissue, into human tissue, using a box cutter? Like like you guys, like, are we fucking stupid? Are you talking to little kids? Even bedtime stories are more believable than this.
So on the subject of believable or unbelievable story, the big one was babies beheaded.
Yeah.
40 of them.
Yes, and Joe Biden saw pictures. He said, and when the White House was asked, what about the pictures?
They walked it back immediately. So it was this. So what I get is, and we're going to talk a little bit about Zaka.
But Biden lies the whole
By the way,
time.
let's talk about Zaka, by the way, in context. So there's a group called Zaka, for those of you who don't know, religious volunteers, ultra-Orthodox, who turn up at crime scenes, tragedies, natural disasters, collect bodies, try and get them ready for Jewish burials. But they end up wrecking crime scenes. They're not credible organizations when it comes to their testimonies. The founder of Zaka, ironically the group that has spread so many stories about dead babies and sexual violence, he committed suicide a few years ago when he was accused of mass child rape. They have a long history of being accused by Israeli media of trying to fundraise off of atrocities. And their volunteers came up with a lot of outlandish stories. A lot of stories, the ones you mentioned, etc., come from Zaka and another group called United Hatzalah. At Zaka is a group that has been caught again and again, their volunteers, again and again, lying about what happened on October 7th, claiming to have seen babies executed, beheaded, put in ovens, etc., which didn't happen. A lot of these stories come from Zaka and United Hatzalah. They've never apologized properly. They just say, it was an emotional day. And yet the media keeps using them as a source, these groups that have absolutely no expertise in these fields. What's astonishing is I can believe that on a day of tragedy and chaos like that, where the military are absent and complete amateurs are at crime scenes, I can get the chaos. I can get people saw things, got things wrong. But the beheaded baby story comes days later, and it's perpetuated for days on end. An Israeli reporter for I-24 first says a commander told her this story. They throw in, people don't realize this, not just 40 beheaded babies, Bassem. Do you know that one colonel called Vash, Golan Vash, he said that he personally witnessed 8 burned babies inside a kibbutz, and that he personally evacuated. He carried the baby out that was beheaded. No such baby exists. That video, Bassem, is still up. The video of him saying this is still up on the Israeli government's official Twitter feed. As of the day of recording today, it is still up on that feed. So this is not accidents. This is not fog of war.
No.
This is not just a bit of chaos and confusion. They deliberately took the most emotive subject to justify their genocide.
My favorite is that the whole idea about like baby in ovens, which was repeated by Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House.
Repeated very recently,
only
again,
2 weeks ago,
on CNN.
A couple of months ago. But here's the thing. The way that it's like, it was just like one of the rescuers where they were so shocked and traumatized. So he was misrepresented with the only way that you saw something and you think it's a baby baked in oven, that you are on acid. There is no other explanation. It's not traumatization.
I mean, there is another explanation.
It's not traumatization.
You're a liar.
No, it's not.
I mean, you're a liar.
You're either a liar or you're on very, 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 very bad drugs. This is the kind of like acid will make you see. I don't know. I haven't tried it, but this is crazy. The fact that you openly say baked babies in ovens and say, oh, sorry, he just. He was mistaken.
It got worse. They said the babies were hung on clotheslines.
Yeah, that's another baby. It's
insane.
No.
But the weaponized...
baby is in oven. That's different from the baby online clothes. It's different from the baby that was cut off from a pregnant woman in her womb. So, these are 3 different babies. Get your facts checked.
Get my facts checked. And they're all, by the way, from these volunteer groups who are then
and they were all traumatized.
Hold on. Who are then quoted in the New York Times, in CNN, in all the media organizations, in the BBC, without journalists in the West doing the basic work to tell their readers, these guys have also said stuff that's completely discredited them. If you or I were eyewitnesses and made up stories like this, we would be laughed out of court, we would be laughed out of the media, we would be laughed out of our jobs. Yet these people are still spreading the kind of crap.
And yet New York Times get the Pulitzer.
Using sources like this. So these stories, I just want to ask you one thing, which is...
By the way, New York Times, I can't cancel my subscription for you for over a year. You guys get us to pay $8 a month, and I'm trying to call their customer service, and I cannot cancel my subscription. It's horrible.
Have you taken that subscription money and put it into a Zeteo subscription? He shamelessly asks small businessmen.
I am part of Zeteo. I should be getting the money.
Free. Yes, you should have a free. You have a free sub, of course. He has a free sub, but you at home don't. So make sure you sign up. Look. I just want to ask a serious question. Funny, but serious. You are a father.
Can you actually be serious in this?
I have.
Can you?
I'm very serious. I'm always serious.
Loosen
I
up.
have resting angry Muslim face. I have RAMF, Bassem. I have resting angry Muslim face. Even when I'm happy, I look angry.
I know, but the situations like this is where you really have to put logic behind you.
But I'm angry. No, but I'm angry because I'm a father. You're a father. They knew what they were doing by using babies as the way to
decapitated.
Justify. By the way, I should point out, recently in Rafah, we actually saw with our own eyes a decapitated baby.
But they don't care.
From an Israeli bomb.
But they're Palestinians.
That
cancels out.
They don't count.
But
the tragic irony of lying about something so horrific to then go do violence in Gaza, which actually caused real decapitated babies. But they knew what they were doing when they said babies. That emotion that went around the world.
Because this is what happens. If you see a baby, what do you see? They can only do 3 things: smile, cry, and poop. That's it. There's no threat. But if you go in as a person seeing a baby and you take your knife, you you go through the skin, the tissue, the trachea, the spine, and then you do that 40 times. Those are animals. And if they're animals, they deserve what they're getting. So now we can carpet bomb everybody.
Remember, Yoav Gallant used the phrase animals on October 8th. Just one last point I want to say on the baby front as a journalist. One, the people who said that stuff have never been held to account. The journalists who propagated it. There's no corrections.
No.
You know, Douglas Murray and John Podhoretz and all these pro-Israel pundits wrote columns in the media. There's no corrections appended. No one's gone back and put a correction at the bottom on a lot of these pieces. And number 2, I've been trying to say this to American interviewers in particular for a while. When the Israeli military lie and lie and lie again to you again and again and again, at some point, don't you say, fool me once, shame on me, right? Fool me, whatever the bloody phrase is. At some point, don't you say, we got to stop being propagandized. We got to stop buying this bullshit.
We say that, but it's people on the other side who want this comfortable lies in order to give them justification.
No, I understand.
To see what happens. But
we took years to stop believing police departments when they said, "Oh yeah, the black man pulled a gun on us at the traffic stop." Now we say, let's not believe the first police statement. But when Israeli generals are saying, Israeli colonels are saying, "I carried a beheaded baby in my arms," you should never trust that man again. He should be laughed out of all the court of public opinion and the media. Instead, We continue to platform them and give them weird respect and deference that we wouldn't give the North
You
Korean
already know
military
how these
or the Russian military.
Dude, you already know how these people think. You are in a debate and you were booed when you mentioned Oxfam. So this is like people.
But that's what I'm saying. Those are the extremists. I'm talking about journalists who claim to be upholding, democratic skepticism, journalistic fact checks.
That doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work anymore. That doesn't work anymore.
So let's talk about a subject.
There are lies and frauds.
So let's talk about a big journalistic failure.
They're not even good comedians.
Let's talk about a big journalistic failure. If we're going to talk about the fallout from October 7th and some of the claims made, we can't not talk about sexual violence. Hugely contentious issue, provocative issue, emotional issue, understandably, for a lot of people. And we need to talk about some of the kind of competing claims and credible claims and propaganda around this subject. But I just want to let viewers and listeners know that this discussion is going to talk about sexual violence. The specifics are disturbing, they are traumatizing, and if anyone listening or watching at home does need help on this issue, there's a list of mental health resources in our show notes for survivors of sexual violence and other harmful, traumatic experiences. It is a very serious and upsetting subject, we know that, but it's something we have to talk about. And I'm just going to start, because everyone, if you talk about this stuff, you're immediately caused a rape deny, if you even try to have a discussion about what's happened since October 7th. And I just want to set the scene with a couple of things. Number one, the United Nations Commission of Inquiry put out their report last week, and they said, the week before last, and they said on this subject, the Commission identified patterns indicative of sexual violence in several locations and concludes that Israeli women were disproportionately subjected to these crimes. The Commission did not find credible evidence, however, that militants received orders to commit sexual violence, and so it was unable to make conclusions on this issue. It says the Commission has not been able to independently verify allegations of rape due to a lack of access to victims, witnesses, and crime sites, and the obstruction of its investigation by the Israeli authorities. So, Bassem, as you know, you've been following this for the last 8 months. The Israeli government and some of its defenders abroad, people like Sheryl Sandberg and others, have been stressing that the world has ignored the voices of Israeli Jewish women who were attacked, assaulted, taken hostage, and allegedly raped en masse, they say, on October the 7th. And some people, and I would include myself in this bucket, I would say there's 3 types of groups. There's one group of people who say, you must accept that there was mass rape on October 7th and that Hamas used it as a weapon of war. It was all part of the plan. There's another group of people who say, nobody was raped on 7th. It's all Israeli propaganda. And there's me, and I put myself in this bucket that says, maybe there was. But where is the investigation? Where is the independent investigation? Why are the Israelis blocking independent investigators? If you want me to accept the Israeli government's word for it, I will not. They say believe women. And we do believe women. But the problem is a lot of the reporting and a lot of the discourse has not involved women. It's involved Israeli spokespersons and evidence-free claims and UN investigators being blocked access.
There was a tweet by one of the propaganda Twitter accounts that is run by the Israeli military. I think it's called War Rooms or War Tactics, whatever. And on October 7th at 7 p.m., they had a tweet of pictures of Israeli women. And they said Hamas is using rape as a weapon. That was just as October 7th was happening. They planted this. And I just want to say something, and I know that we're going to get into this. This has been a technique that has been used forever. White people against black communities that have been using gendered accusations. And this is why something like the Atlanta Massacre in 1906 happened, Forsyth Massacre in 1912 happened, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, Rosewood in Florida 1922. All of these were started by a rumor of a black man assaulting or raping a white woman, and that led to the decimation and the killing of whole black neighborhood, especially in Tulsa. It is a very old game, old techniques, and the fact that they still do it in the age of information, where people can find out for themselves, it is really heartbreaking. I know this is a very sensitive subject, but with any crime, it's all about the reporting and how credible it is. And when you find someone like the New York Times having this article screams without words, I would call this basically journalism without facts. This is exactly what this is. Basically, Jeffrey Gettleman, who was the author of this, who was the Pulitzer winner, he came up on a video and he said, I really, getting evidence is not my job. Evidence is a legal term. I just tell people information and stories, and they come up. This is like me saying, I'm a doctor. Saving lives is not my role. Healing is a medical term. I'm a wellness poet. This is how bad it is. You cannot just say oh, I'm not a firefighter. I'm a flame dancer. This is crazy. I mean,
So-
what kind of integrity? What kind of professionality do we expect from you when you say he's an investigative journalist? It's like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm a chef. I know that my food tastes like shit. I'm a culinary artist. It doesn't work this way.
The irony of that New York Times piece was it was supposed to be the defining piece that made the case that A, mass rape happened, it was systematic, and B, that it was a Hamas order. And that piece has now been debunked, discredited. Multiple journalism professors have written an open letter saying the New York Times needs to investigate this piece. The witnesses have fallen
Their
apart.
own podcast. Their own
Daily.
podcast, The Daily, they canceled their episode about the
According to The
article
Intercept,
because there was not enough evidence, and then the New York Times went crazy. I come back to the idea. It's like evidence is a legal term. It's like, hey, I'm a pilot. Flying is an aviation term. I'm a gravity negotiator. If you crash, that's just turbulence expressing yourself.
It's worse. Gettleman said, my job is to move people. That is not the job of a journalist,
Wow.
actually. That's the job of a politician, of a propagandist,
So this is
of
like
a activist. It's not the job of a
So it's
journalist.
like, hey, I'm a doctor. My job is not to heal people. My job is to cut people. This is how bad this is. This is
But I mean, it goes against the very
This is
tenet.
the worst
He's not
job
opinion.
description you've ever said. And
He's not an opinion journalist. As an opinion journalist, you can move people with a wonderful column.
Yes.
He was an investigative journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, goes to Israel with a former food writer,
Who's the food writer?
Adam Seller, and Adam Seller's uncle's partner, a woman called Anat Schwartz, a woman who'd been liking tweets about let's turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. Former Israeli, listen to this, Bassem, former Israeli Air Force intelligence official. She was picked to write this front page story.
Maybe she was picked because her nephew showed up at the Jerusalem New York Times office or DoorDash. It's like, oh, you deliver
food
food so well. I'm sure you can deliver the truth with the same efficiency.
By the way, as someone who has written for the New York Times, I've written op-eds. You have to jump through 100 hoops.
Are you
to
name
get
dropping
in-
now?
I'm name dropping. You have to jump through 100 hoops to get into the Times, and yet they dropped all of that for this huge piece that went around the world that bolstered support for Israel's genocide in Gaza at a moment when support globally
Maybe
was
you should
flagging.
work with Uber Eats, and that
I'll
will get you
the
back.
gag. At a time when support for the war was flagging, right? This piece comes out. And again, I want us to be able to talk about sexual violence. Clearly stuff happened. The UN says sexual violence. But the idea that, for example, one of the witnesses in the New York Times talked about a gang rape. This is the same woman who also said that women were beheaded. That never happened. And New York Times just cut that bit out.
And here's the thing.
Because the credibility of their witness was affected. They just didn't tell
And
their
other than
readers.
New York Times, let's talk about Jake Tapper. That guy, he just transformed his show as a platform for every single lying scoundrel that was proven lying, like Rez Cohen and Sherry Mendez. These people were called liars by the Israeli media themselves. The Israelis themselves don't trust them.
I know you're.
Rez
Hold
Cohen.
on,
Wait.
You need to give some context, Bassem. I'm waiting. Give some context.
Rez Cohen is a guy who has changed his testimony 5 times until he made it on 4th of January to be on Jake Tapper's show. This is exactly the definition of fake it till you make it. He faked his stories till he made it on
And when the New York Times...
And then Jake Tapper, he did it what is your team doing? What is your team doing fact checking? What do they do?
I want to put in context. Shari Mendez, I should point out, is an Israeli with no experience,
No volunteer.
no experience in law, no experience in this field of sexual violence, no forensic experience, told lies about fetuses being ripped from wombs. So, Bassem, we could talk about Shari Mendez and her lack of credibility, Raz Cohen. We could talk about how the article, again, I just want to be clear because people are going to clip this and say, you're a rape denier. No, I'm saying that I want to hear what happened to Israeli women on October 7th. But what we're getting is bullshit. It's not helping the cause when your main investigative piece falls apart, when UN investigators are blocked from going into Israel. Let's have the investigation. Let's hear from people who are not Shari Mendez and Raz Cohen and Israeli officials one Israeli official, she put out pictures of Kurdish fighters and said these are Israeli women who were raped. I mean, how are we supposed to take this seriously? I want to take it seriously. Please give me more credible voices. And it's a sensitive subject. People get very upset. So I thought the best person to talk to on this, or one of the very best people to talk to on this, is Azadeh Moaveni. She teaches journalism at NYU. She's also a war correspondent who has served in war zones. And she also ran the gender program at the International Crisis Group. So she knows her stuff. She wrote a wonderful piece for the London Review of Books about how this issue of sexual violence is used and abused in war zones. Azadeh is here with us now. Welcome, Azadeh, to We're Not Kidding.
Thank you, Mehdi. Hi, Bassem.
I just want to start with your piece in the London Review of Books. What made you sit down and want to write that piece on such a controversial issue when you know that anything you say on this subject will get you attacked from one side or the other, especially from the pro-Israel side that says anyone who even wants to talk about rape or sexual violence outside of the context of Hamas did it as a weapon of war, you're a rape denier?
It's a good question. And many times in the throes of the reporting and the writing, I bitterly regretted it, I have to say. But I kept waiting for someone else to do it. I kept thinking, surely someone will come along, someone with experience reporting on women in conflict or rape and war, and do the sort of serious holistic treatment of how sexual violence is operating across all of this conflicts, and sort of move it out of this incredibly sort of hypersensitized propagandistic space that this story had ended up in, for the sake of actually getting to the bottom of what happened to Israeli women, and also for the sake of looking beyond just October 7th and just see how sexual violence has spilled out on the Palestinian side, which we rarely hear about at all, and in Israeli society more widely as well. We don't hear about rapes in the displacement centers where people in the north, from the north who've been evacuated. Anyway, I was hoping someone else would do the big, serious, traditional sort of gender sensitive reporting, and it wasn't being done, and so I threw myself into it, perhaps for, I don't know, better or for worse.
And can I just ask as a follow-up, you said gender sensitive reporting. I mean, Bassem and I are sitting here talking about the New York Times coverage. We are two men. We have a political stance on this conflict. How do we talk about what went down on October the 7th in a way that both respects the fact that, yes, we should believe women, whether they're Jewish women, Palestinian women, white women, black women, Western women, Eastern women, but also the fact that we are being met with a blizzard of bullshit around some of this stuff too. So again, I'll say my position. My position is clearly, according to the UN and many investigations so far, sexual violence, gender-based violence took place on October the 7th and afterwards. But mass rape as a weapon of war, I'm still waiting for the evidence of that because the New York Times did not provide it. Multiple people who came out, like Physicians for Human Rights Israel, have now walked back from their original report saying, well, actually, we've realized a lot of the witnesses we relied on were not credible witnesses. So how do we talk about it in this way where we don't end with people saying, oh, you're just denying rape, you're just rape deniers?
Well, I think just taking the subject very seriously and scrutinizing what we have come to learn about what happened on that day versus the stories that were told and then instrumentalized about what happened on that day is serious ethical scrutiny. I mean, I think the conversation that you're having is doing that. Separating those two things out is really hard. It takes a lot of work, sort of absorbing what the UN said in these multiple reports, looking at the dozens of reports that have come out of Israel, Palestine, by different rights groups who've worked on this issue. But I guess to me, the sensitive thing is also widening it out. I mean, if we're looking at sexual violence in a conflict setting, we're not just looking at one day, although we will look at that one day. We have to also look at what it means that Israeli society is now saturated with guns because of its right-wing government and what that means for domestic violence at home. I mean, serious scholars and researchers who work on sexual violence look at it as a continuum. I mean, when you have a society at war like this, that violence is not going to be only confined to hurting women in the battlefield. It will be in detention centers, it will be in homes. And so just bringing that kind of serious sort of perspective to it.
Well, I know how sensitive it is, and I've been trying to talk to Mehdi about talking it, and he's rightly so. Of course, he's worried about talking it, and this is why you're bringing you an expert. But as a person, I'm just like sick and tired of like not being allowed to talk about anything because of the intimidation. It's as if like only Israeli kids are killed, only Israeli civilians are killed, only Israeli women are being subjected to sexual violence. And in the same time, I mean, like there's this slogan that have been going on the internet forever. It's like every accusation is a confession. And this is one of the incidents where an accusation turned out actually to be a confession, because everything that they have claimed that Palestinians did to their women, they have actually done it over the years to Palestinian women over and over, and also Palestinian men. And and I think the New York Times finally mentioned that in a very long article that is consisted of 80 paragraphs, and they buried it in the 76th paragraph.
About men being raped in detention, Palestinian men,
Yeah, Palestinian men. Oh, of course, you have to talk about Palestinian.
Sorry,
because the word Palestinian seems to cancel out whatever atrocities being done to them.
I interviewed a Democratic congressman recently, and I told him about these allegations of rape with metal rods, hot metal rods against Palestinian men. He said, I never knew any of this. I didn't know any of this. It's amazing. A member of Congress claimed they didn't even know about what's happening.
You said Palestinian prisoners are being raped to death by Israeli soldiers?
Yes, this is a report in the New York Times last week.
Okay. I don't believe that to be true. Nonetheless, the question...
A 41-year-old detainee said the interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick and it felt like fire. He said another detainee died after they put the electric stick up his anus.
No, it's repulsive.
And yet, as a day, we've had this kind of onslaught of coverage. And I just want to, you said broaden it beyond...
Okay, I'm going to stop you. This is exactly how how they react to you when they tell them about this. When they tell them that like a horrible atrocity happened on the other side to the Palestinians.
They're not deniers.
They said, oh, this is terrible, horrible. Oh my God, let's talk now about October 7th. Let's talk about the Israeli hostages. Let's talk about
And we
the
don't
women.
call them rape deniers.
Yeah, exactly. No, they would say, oh, this is the best reaction you will ever get. They will not tell, oh, it didn't happen. First of all, they will deny it. It's like, oh, wow. Oh, we need to look into this. This is terrible. Now let's go back to the subject and talk about the stuff that we care about, because this is exactly the same way about Kirby and Miller and all of those like White House correspondents. Oh, we are investigating. This is terrible. But let's go back and talk about how the Israel is being victimized.
So what's interesting, Azadeh, is you know this phrase, whataboutism, which is often used on all sides of the conflict. And I'm often accused of whataboutism. And what's interesting with whataboutism is the definition of whataboutism is to try and point to something over there. Well, what about this when you're talking about that as a way to distract? When I talk about sexual violence against Palestinians, it's not whataboutism because it's part and parcel of the same thing. I want an investigation of all sexual violence. I'm not dismissing what happened on October the 7th. I want to know what happened. If Hamas did carry out these atrocities as a weapon of war, we should know about it. The problem is, how do we get to the bottom of that when you have the Israelis, an unreliable narrator, the Israeli government, they say believe Israeli women. Sure, as long as they're not members of the Israeli government, because I don't believe any members of the Israeli government or military after all the lies they've told. And of course, some Israeli women have denied this stuff, including the sisters of Gal Abdush, the woman at the center of the New York Times piece. They say our sister wasn't raped. The New York Times made this up. So where does...
It's like America says like, no. You were. It's like
we'll tell you.
It happened to you. It happened to you.
So Azadeh, how do we then respond in a way that is consistent across the board, so we can talk about all of it at once?
Well, it's certainly not whataboutism for people who do this, as scholars and lawyers and international lawyers and conflict researchers. I mean, in any conflict setting, when you're looking at sexual violence, you look at sexual violence committed on all sides, because that's the picture of the conflict. When, I work in Nigeria, I look at what the Nigerian military does to women in detention who've been part of Boko Haram. I look at what Boko Haram does. You look at the whole cycle of the conflict, because it is a conflict. It's constantly, the two sides are constantly hurting each other and responding to each other. So certainly it's not whataboutism to try and see how violence against women, threats of it, reporting about it, instrumentalization of it operates within the conflict itself. I mean, that's what we do everywhere, whether it's Syria or Iraq or even Ukraine. It's in this one particular conflict that all of our methods and our standards that we've accumulated over decades of this kind of work are suspended, and we're like in a totally different territory.
It's a very important point there, that they've been suspended. We've accepted testimonies and reports and sweeping statements. Sheryl Sandberg made a movie featuring people from Zaka who have been discredited. And I would say,
and they featured Palestinians prisoners who were under torture, and they're using that as evidence. And the White House goes and screen that stuff
Yes.
as evidence. And the thing is, this is what
Torture.
this is
That's
how
what happened to Western values. Evidence from torture.
No. Palestinian cancels out.
Yes.
So here's the thing about like whataboutism. Israel is like someone going into a coffee shop, killing the barista, and so like, what did you do? It's like, oh, well, we're not going to talk about my cold coffee. This is exactly what Israel does. Is that they do all of these atrocities, and it all has to be. This is like Israel is Karen on steroids. It's just like me, my safety, my problem, my feeling, and everything else have to disintegrate.
Well, Azadeh made a very good point about kind of this is the way we've treated this conflict uniquely, and Israel always claims, oh, you treat us differently. Actually, we treat you better. You get away with stuff that other countries don't get away with. And Ukraine you mentioned, and I'm fascinated in your piece, you mentioned something that I didn't know, I had to go away and look it up, that the Ukrainian human rights ombudsman, the chief in charge of that's our ally, Ukraine, was actually fired and actually criticized by Ukrainian lawmakers for exaggerating stories about sexual violence by the Russians against Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians were like, you're making us look bad by exaggerating these stories. And I looked at that, I thought, wow, but if I said that about Israel, I'm a rape denier. Here's our ally, Ukraine. And the fact is, it happens in every war zone. Governments lie.
Yes, they make allegations of sort of widespread rape on a scale that is often times 100 or times 1,000 more of what turns out to be actual cases, and then have a very awkward time walking it back. And that's not to discount the difficulty of reporting and sort of investigating rape and sexual violence in conflict zones. I mean, it's incredibly hard. You don't have, as in this case, you often don't have forensic evidence. You often don't have witnesses. And so it is extraordinarily difficult trying to piece it together for the sake of any investigation, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Syria. And there's, of course, the fear of women to reports because there will be terrible stigma. There's like war trauma that fragments memories. It's very complex. But also, it is complicated by governments instrumentalizing it so they can mobilize their publics. I mean, rape taps into our deepest fears in any society. So it's hugely effective as a sort of mobilizing tactic when you need to galvanize your public to commit atrocities that perhaps they're not ready to commit without some sort of justification. And so it serves this purpose as well in many wars, not this one. I mean, we've seen Ethiopia is a conflict in which rape has been rampant and largely ignored.
So one of the things that there is bothering me is the fact that, and I said at the beginning of the show, is that now all of these lies are becoming cemented into truth. They're cementing into documentaries, they're cementing into articles, and now it is the official statement because it is being parroted by American officials. Like the documentary by Sheryl Sandberg, now it is, everybody's going away with that. Now, years from now, that will be the memory of the world. What do you say about this documentary by Sheryl Sandberg?
I mean, Sheryl Sandberg has herself said that she has no expertise on this, even though I think she went on to brief like 5 different parliaments in Europe about sexual violence. So she's a strange sort of example of the sexual violence entrepreneur, someone who just shows up and is a sort of overnight expert and is sort of invited into halls of power because of the state that they're doing advocacy on behalf of, essentially. But what I think is striking about her film is that it makes the case that has been dismantled in the New York Times reporting, and it makes a case that is directly contradicted in the Commission of Inquiry report that was just released, which makes it very, very clear that there was sexual violence on October 7th, but it did not amount to a crime against humanity. There is not the evidence to say or show that it was part of a widespread attack against civilians. So the UN has put out its report, it has done its investigation, and it contradicts what Sheryl Sandberg's film claims, and yet Kamala Harris invites this film into the halls of American power. So it's just as from a journalistic perspective, as a professor of journalism, I feel incredible dissonance. I mean, this is an administration that rails against the threat that disinformation brings to our democracy, and yet it's sort of trafficking in it.
And one last question for you today before I let you go. Do you also teach journalism? You're not just a journalist. We had a bunch of journalism professors write open letter to the Times saying, deal with this piece, this screams without words piece that has been debunked on many levels. They haven't kind of revoked it. They haven't apologized for it. Interestingly, the Times of London, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, right-wing newspaper, recently did an investigation. It's the first time I've seen in the mainstream media, Bassem, saying what we've been saying, asking some of the questions. The headline was, Israel says Hamas weaponized rape. Does the evidence add up? The subhead of the article says the Israeli government insists that Hamas formally sanctioned sexual assault on October the 7th, but investigators say the evidence does not stand up to scrutiny. And Azadeh, the journalist who wrote that, have had to make their social media accounts private because pro-Israel trolls are now attacking them as rape deniers. Reporters for Murdoch's Times of London are now being accused simply because they're saying, well, the evidence doesn't stand up. What do you make as a professor of journalism about how the Western media has covered this story, especially the New York Times?
Well, the New York Times story, I mean, I think we must recognize, features multiple problems, just one of which, if it was on any other subject, would have led to a reporter stepping down, being taken off a beat, a kind of formal reassessment of the reporting, as the Times did with its Iraq War coverage, the sort of giving back of awards that we saw with the Caliphate podcast. If just one of the problems that this piece is burdened by, I think, had come to pass with another subject, the Times would have admitted to journalistic malpractice and adjusted its reporting in a significant way.
Azadeh, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your expertise.
Thank you both.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Bassem, fascinating, important discussion with Azadeh there, because you don't hear, I wish we'd see more of her on some of our mainstream outlets talking about this subject in a nuanced way and mentioning Palestinians, as you did. Because, of course, you know, the UN report that we've mentioned many times on this show, I urge people to go look at the UN COI report, Commission of Investigation, Commission of Inquiry. It said that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence are part of ISF, Israeli Security Force, operating procedures. You put it so well. Every accusation is a confession. We haven't been able to find evidence that Hamas used sexual violence as a weapon of war. We do know that there are credible claims of sexual violence on October the 7th. But here the UN is saying that the ISF use it as part of their operating procedures. This is what they do.
They're their MO. Their MO, babe.
But no one cares. But no one cares, as you say. This is the problem. But we care, which is why we did this episode today. We'll get attacked for this episode heavily. What's new for you and I? We tried to do it in a factual way. I urge people to go look at the UN report, which is might be some of our viewers might not like what's in the UN report. It's very critical of the Palestinian side, of the Israeli side. It calls out Israeli war crimes, Hamas war crimes. It calls out sexual violence on both sides. And look, I would just say to people at home, if you truly care about women, care about all women, and if you care about what happened to Israeli women on October 7th, then support an investigation. If you don't support the Israeli government allowing in independent investigators to investigate stuff, don't pretend you care about the stuff. It's just a rhetorical weapon to justify violence in Gaza, unfortunately.
Good old propaganda.
Well, we've tried to debunk some of the propaganda on civilian deaths, on babies, on sexual violence. There's a lot more out there. We can't do it justice. But we will keep talking about this subject,
Yes.
Bassem, as long as you'll let me come to your beautiful city and talk to you. We'll keep talking about it. Bassem, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We're Not Kidding is a Zateo production. I'm your host, Mehdi Hassan, and today's co-host was Bassem Youssef. Our executive producer is Misha Youssef. Our producer and editor is Frank Capello. Our music was composed by Andy Clausen. Our design is by Alicia Tatone, and the title card animation is by Ehsan Mezgali.
It was such a, for lack of a better word, traumatic and difficult to try to choose which image of which dead baby should I put in this report today. You know, it was horrifying. And there were a lot of images as well of, you know, fragments of US bombs next to civilians. And I would show, look at this US complicity. The US complicity is undeniable.
Hala Gharrit is the first American diplomat to publicly resign in protest of the Biden administration's support for Israel's war in Gaza. With an 18-year career at the State Department, Hala most recently served as the Arabic language spokesperson. And she joins us now to talk about her decision. Hala Gharrit, thank you so much for speaking to us on Real Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Mohammed. It's a pleasure.
Hala, I wanted to start, you know, there was this quote that I read for you in an article. You said that the Biden administration's policy towards Gaza really changed your career plans. I mean, can you elaborate on this? Let's start there. Your decision to resign from the State Department.
Yeah, well, it was a really agonizing decision, Mohammed, I can tell you. So I joined the State Department 18 years ago. Not to age myself, that was straight out of grad school. So basically, right out, my entire adult life. I studied international affairs, Middle Eastern studies, my undergraduate degrees, master's in Georgetown School of Foreign Service, very traditional trajectory to join the State Department. And being a diplomat was my dream job, to be honest. I felt like if you want to see change, then you make the change happen. You join the system, you go inside government, you make your voice heard, you advocate. And so for me, I felt like I could do that effectively for the last 18 years. And with this particular policy, it was such heartbreak day after day to see the administration continue specifically to funnel unconditional military assistance, which was killing so many people in Gaza, and the unwillingness of the policy to shift. It sort of shattered my belief that you can change things from within. There's a certain extent that you can. And then I began to feel complicit because it was clear that the policy was not changing.
You started to feel complicit.
I did. I began to feel complicit because once I realized that I was not able to change the policy at all, then from that point on, I began to feel complicity. Because before that point on, I thought, well, I'm here to try to make a difference. I'm here to try to shed light upon what's happening in Gaza, maybe only if the policymakers understood, maybe only if they realized this. But after a while, and after me making them aware and things were still not shifting, it became clear that there was no more role for me in government, that it was more important for me to resign and speak out. And thus I decided to change my course of career.
That's an interesting point that you raise, Hela, because I interviewed Lily Greenberg Call not too long ago, who you may know, who resigned from the Department of the Interior. And we were talking about the idea of, that she wanted to give it a shot to basically see if she can change something from the inside. And then when she believed that she couldn't, she decided to publicly resign. This whole idea of trying to change policy from within government. I mean, what does that even entail? Where do you start?
That's a really good question. So I'll give you a little bit of an insider's peek at American diplomacy and how it works. So when you become an American diplomat, you choose what your path is in terms of your field of specialty. So I was a political officer. You can also be a consular officer, which is in charge of visas and American citizen services. You can also be a public diplomacy officer in charge of educational exchanges and press. I was political. So in political, we're the ones who write the cables. We're the ones who usually work on the more sensitive issues on bilateral relationships. And we're the ones who also make policy recommendations through our cables and our reports and are in the meetings, in the government official meetings. So I worked in Yemen as a political and human rights officer. I worked in Qatar as well, leading the political and economic section. So you're able to do a lot. So in Qatar, I helped launch a bilateral economic policy initiative between the US and Qatar, for example. In Yemen, I got a lot of funding to support human rights advocates. Like, you feel like you're doing something with your job at the embassy, right? You're pushing things one way, you're advocating for things one way. You're obviously still under the administration, so you work within that framework. But I always felt throughout my career that I was doing good, definitely more good than harm, right? And this was actually my last role, was actually my first public-facing role. I was a spokesperson for the State Department in the Arab world, based in Dubai. So you can imagine it was never an easy job, right? To be the face of the American government in this part of the world. But honestly, Mohammed, I was honored to do it. I was proud to do it. I felt like I wanted to show a more humane face of the US government. I wanted to highlight the good things that we were doing, including at that time, now it's ironic to say this, but at that time, surging humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, for example, or the work that we were doing on Sudan to try to broker a ceasefire again back, a few months ago. But when it came to this policy, once we got the talking points from Washington, for me, they were they were a non-starter. So I actually refused to do interviews on Gaza from the very beginning of the conflict, because from day one, really, they were so dehumanizing to the Palestinians that I could not, in good conscience, go out on Arab television and promote this talking point. So I pushed back on the department. And that goes back to sort of trying to influence. So I thought pushing back on the department was eventually going to affect a certain level of change. It obviously didn't. I ended up resigning and getting in a lot of trouble before my resignation because I refused to give interviews on Gaza and was accused of refusing to do my job and all of this crazy stuff that happened.
I can only imagine going on Arabic television and, basically saying those U.S. talking points in Arabic. I can only imagine how they would have been received.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we know how they're received, right? They're not well received. It's all generating a backlash. And that was my point to the department. And I was writing, instead of doing interviews, I was writing daily reports to Washington, basically documenting, look how our talking points are being rejected. Look how they're causing a backlash. Look how what they're indeed doing is generating an increase in anti-Americanism, which is a threat to our own US national security. Again, bringing it back to this is a threat to America. And as an American diplomat, that was my focus, right? And of course, talking about how inhumane the policy is, how immoral it was, and how it is actually illegal. It's violating so many US laws that we continue to surge weaponry. But it was a very strange time in the department that I was so vocal. And for the first time in my career, realized actually that comes at a cost. Because I've always been vocal. I've never been shy about sharing my perspectives based on my professional experience and my expertise in the region. But with this particular policy, it was basically, put up or shut up, just basically do what you're supposed to do. And that led me to my resignation as well.
Going back to what you're saying, I take it that there wasn't one singular event that made you want to resign. It was a cumulative buildup.
Indeed, it was a cumulative buildup. I can tell you that there were many, many things that happened where I would say, okay, I can't handle it anymore. Okay, this is it. I have to resign. There's no way. And every time I would hold on a little bit more hope and say, okay, it can't really be that bad. Our policymakers can't really, really keep doubling down on this policy. And again, I kept on sending those daily reports, and that was giving me some hope, at least, that I was doing something. But the department asked me to stop sending those reports in January. So then after that, it basically began. I figured, okay, it's the time for me to resign. And it was a very lengthy process to resign, as you can imagine, after 18 years. So that's what led us to here.
And what kind of repercussions before even publicly resigning when you were pushing back?
It was a bit of a mixed bag. I had some folks back in Washington express support and even some express admiration for my quote unquote bravery, although I don't consider it brave to, just state. I was very much stating facts. I was never stating opinions. I was reporting about events that were happening on the ground in Gaza. It wasn't but even shedding light on those realities was considered brave, which to me was a bit perplexing. But I was also very much sidelined. I was very much silenced. I was taken off of emails in a quite systematic way. I was excluded from meetings. I was excluded from briefing senior officials that normally I would absolutely be briefing. I was excluded from other things. There was a lot of pressure on me to get back on air on Gaza. I was, practically forced into going, but I never did a single interview. Again, not because I personally disagreed with the policy, but because fundamentally I was documenting as an American diplomat how this policy was hurting US interests, not helping them. I was very much aware of how I would personally be labeled as an Arab American, that I would particularly have some type of affinity that other diplomats may not. And so I was quite systematic in how I documented everything. Nothing came from my opinion. Everything came from the field, from pan-Arab media, from Arab social media, to document the repercussions of our policy, thinking that this sound logic would have some type of effect. But unfortunately, it didn't. I was told, even after my resignation, I was told your reports went to the most senior levels of government. They were read. They mattered, but we all see what's still happening in Gaza, right? We see it with our own eyes. So it's devastating. It's devastating. But since my resignation, I'm continuing to do advocacy from the outside. So hopefully, with everyone's efforts combined, this policy will eventually shift one way or another.
You resigned in April, right? And I'm curious if someone said, why did it take you 6 months to resign? Is it because the environment now is a bit more easier because a lot more people are speaking out against, U.S. policy on Gaza?
That's a very, very fair question. I'll tell you, there are two reasons why it took me so long. One is the hope that things that I was doing and things that other diplomats that I knew were doing were going to affect change in the policy. Because normally, our policymakers in Washington listen to their diplomats out in the field, where they're subject matter experts. We provide them feedback, we provide them information. They take that into consideration and they affect policy changes based on that. At the end of the day, it's the president, it's the Secretary of State that make the decisions, but it usually us as diplomats feed in to their decision-making process. And I knew that it wasn't just me. It was diplomats across the region that were shouting, basically, this is such a dangerous policy on so many levels. Please change course. It is hurting us in every way, shape, and form. So based on precedent and based on how policies were affected previously in my 18-year career, I was holding hope that, okay, we're going to be part of the change, and I have to be part of the change. When I started speaking to some very senior diplomats about my thoughts on resignation, they kept on telling me things. Now, more than ever, your voice is needed, Hala. Now, more than ever, we need you. We will amplify your voice. You cannot leave now. If you leave, who else will fill your void? Who else, if you leave now, then Washington won't even hear the perspectives you're sharing. And so that made me feel a sense of guilt for even wanting to resign, right? They said, you can't abandon the government now. And so I held on hope that, okay, maybe I am needed on the inside. And then that eventually was shattered.
Why do you think this was being said to you? Do you feel like now, in hindsight, do you feel it was some sort of strategy, some sort of illusion? Why do you think you were being told this?
Look, I think no diplomat wants to believe that what they're doing on a daily basis does not matter, right? I think every diplomat wants to believe that they can affect some level of change or some level of influence. So I think people were sincere, in their insistence to keep me in. Obviously, I went public, so it was really very much in the department's interest to keep me in. And I think everybody realized that I would go public because I was literally a spokesperson before I resigned, right? So I don't know where there's some interest to trying to keep me in, to keep me from going public, perhaps, I don't know. But I want to believe that, whoever was trying to keep me on the inside was sincere about it. But second, Mohammed, honestly, another reason why it took me so long is strictly logistics. It took a very long time for me to submit my resignation and to follow through on everything because being a diplomat sort of takes over your entire life. It's not just a job. So I was living in diplomatic housing. That means I had to find a new place to live for me and my entire family. The housing market's quite expensive. That took a while. It took a while, and it was an extremely stressful process just because once I made the decision to resign, I wanted it to be done right away, but I couldn't because I needed to find housing. My children's education is rolled up into my job because the embassy was providing payment to my children's school. Even our license plate was a diplomatic license plate. I had to go to the equivalent of the motor vehicles registration place and switch up. That tells you all of the little tiny things that need to get done, but it adds up to a lot of things and lots of paperwork. So it took me a while to even logistically be able to finalize a resignation. So between sort of holding on hope and being very busy in trying to affect change from within, and then once that I realized it wasn't going to happen, then putting that into effect in terms of how do I actually resign, it took a while to do that. And then once I got keys in hand to the new house. Literally, I was like, okay, that's it. Now my family's going to have a place to live. We've got that sorted. Time to move on to the next chapter of my life.
If we try to take a sneak peek into the State Department, what were the channels that were available to you to express discontent over the policy?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple channels depending on where you work, but I mean, every channel that you would think of in any normal job, sort of emails, phone calls, right? There are a lot of working groups, whatever working group you may be in, but also more officially, particularly in the diplomatic corps, the State Department, we write cables.
Right.
So you must have heard of the dissent channel cable. Those are reserved for exceptional circumstance to express dissent. And then there's also what we call front channel cables, which are just cables from the field reporting on whatever X, Y, and Z topic. So it was all of those channels.
Can you give an example of some of these discussions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would reach out to sort of those folks that are my mentor and ask them about the policy. Do they think that it's going to go anywhere, that it's going to shift at all? And they would always tell me things like, we have to try. We have to try. What's strange is that it was very, very rare to run into anyone that was actually in favor of the policy. Very rare. Most of my conversations were, you're totally right. We agree. It's so frustrating. And that is another reason why I actually chose to resign, because when you have across the board, practically the majority of your department telling you that the policy is wrong, yet you are still choosing to not shift the policy. To me, it was very clear that the policy was being run by 4 men. And to me, that's so un-American. It's so not democratic, right? It's not how we're supposed to run. That's another reason why I chose to resign, because in those conversations, it was clear that even very senior officials weren't able to really affect change on the influence on the policy.
And what kind of conversations that you were having with your peers in terms of anger or in terms of disagreement or in terms of dissent? You know, what were you saying about the Biden administration? What were you saying about Netanyahu's government? What were these conversations like?
Well, I can tell you this, that before I resigned, few people spoke openly with me about the policy. There was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of...
There's a lot of fear.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Again, something that in my 18-year career I've never seen. A lot of fear.
A career first for you.
It's a career first. It's unprecedented in my personal experience, where people are literally scared to talk to each other because they don't know how the person's going to react. They don't know where they'll land on this policy. But the reason why I gave this as a preview is because after my resignation became known internally, before it became known publicly, and I was still working in the department for a couple more weeks, so many people reached out to me. People that I hadn't even worked with reached out to me and said, we agree with you completely. We're so frustrated. This policy is so inhumane, but we don't know what to do. We can't resign. Can you please speak up on our behalf once you resign? All of this. And I'm like, whoa, it was actually quite overwhelming, because the overwhelming part was the fact that these people had been quiet beforehand and were only comfortable enough sharing these thoughts after they knew I had resigned.
You were no longer there.
Well, I was no longer there, and I was not, and I wouldn't be a threat in terms of people were scared. What would others say about them? Would other people say, oh, this person's against the policy? What is that going to do? People are scared of retribution. They're scared of what are the career implications if they're not willing to play ball? You know, I became sort of known as the troublemaker. You know, I was just causing so much trouble regarding this policy that it was just almost too much to handle for some, right? So I think people that are concerned about climbing the ladder, people that are worried about their financial security, and I don't want to judge, you know, it's a privilege that I was financially able to resign, right? But I understand very well that not everybody has that ability to do that. They have their own financial constraints or whatnot. So, but it's very telling on the policy that so many people are upset by it and are scared by it. And I have to be blunt, Mohammed, as well as I'm saying all of this. There are a lot of people that are very willfully enabling the policy. Even people that are against the policy are willfully enabling the policy, just because they're doing their job. So that's why it keeps going.
When you say they're afraid, is it more of a personal fear where they don't want to lose their job because, them having a family or whatever that they want to take care of? Or is it a fear of the department letting go of them or labeling them a certain way, or even, giving them a new position within the department or something? Like, where does the fear stem from?
I think it's the labeling. So for one, it's very hard to lose your job when you work for the government. Just for anyone that's out there listening, other fellow diplomats, it's hard to get fired. It takes a long time to get fired. But what we do have in the State Department is something called our corridor reputation. And we basically get good jobs. Once you become a mid-level officer or a senior officer, you get, quote unquote, good jobs by people recommending you, right? Other diplomats recommending you. That's how we operate. And so people are very concerned about how they're seen within the department. People are very concerned about their corridor reputation. And so I think the fear stems mostly from that and from our own evaluation. So we get evaluated yearly, and that determines whether or not we get promoted or not. And those evaluations are written by our supervisors and our supervisor's supervisor. And I can tell you, I was very much threatened with having a bad evaluation multiple times through my own protest of refusing to do interviews. So I think people take career considerations in terms of how vocal they are or not vocal. But I was actually just in Washington this last week, and one of the things that I shared with former colleagues and just everyone that would listen that's in the government is, let's get over that fear, right? We're supposed to be a country of the people, and we are working for the government as public servants. We're not supposed to be scared to share our professional expertise. And that's why I emphasized at the beginning of the interview that it was never about my personal experience. It was about my professional expertise. And I was recording all of that for the department. So there should never be fear in sharing those valuable insights. That's why we were hired. And I think people have a lot more power than they realize in using their voices. But there's power in collective action, right? So if everyone is scared across the board, then there's self-censorship, really, and the department is not hearing these important views. So my hope is, and my hope in speaking out as well, is to let people that are still on the inside feel empowered. Use your voice, use your expertise, raise the alarm, right? And do so collectively so that the department is hearing it from a large swath of people and diplomats across the region, not from just one or two or three here and there.
In your job, what kind of analysis were you relaying back to the Biden administration from the Arab world?
So with this latest conflict, I'll call it a genocide. It's not a conflict. I'll be very clear and blunt about that. I began from very, very early stages writing what we called snapshots, or basically daily reports of summarizing what pan-Arab media, traditional media, and social media was documenting. And the idea was, if you're going to message to the Arab world in an effective manner, you need to be able to understand what they're consuming on a daily basis. So what that entailed was, images that were going viral in Arab social media. So I would put in these daily reports back to the department images of dead babies, of dead toddlers, and it was honestly, Mohammed, like traumatic to put together these reports on a daily basis, because I would gather all of this information and then I would try to dwindle it down to, as horrible as it sounds, the most important or the ones that would make the most impact for a Washington reader. And it was such a, for lack of a better word, traumatic and difficult to try to choose which image of which dead baby should I put in this report today. It was horrifying. And there were a lot of images as well of, fragments of US bombs next to civilians. And I would show, look at this US complicity. The US complicity is undeniable. Look at what people in this part of the world are consuming. You cannot send talking points would say, oh, we have concerns about civilian deaths in Gaza. Like, when you're completely linking it to US complicity. So I would basically write and send these daily reports with links to every single thing. So again, it was documented. And I would also put in there how our talking points were being received. So for example, whenever Linda Thomas Greenfield had a vote at the UN Security Council, and obviously that was seen in the Arab world, and people across the region were so angered by yet again another US veto. And I'm sure you've seen these memes that went with red bloodied hands. Send that to the department.
I don't even think that was Arab specific, to be honest.
Oh, it wasn't, but it was definitely, it went viral throughout the region.
Sure.
But I was told, oh, you're so brave to send these reports. I'm like, this is not bravery. This is just facts. This is literally just what the world is consuming, and in particular, the Arab world. And it's sad if we're trying to hide our policymakers from this reality. This is not about personal feelings. I'm not trying to not hurt Linda Thomas Greenfield's feelings, right? She's a representative of the American people. And when she is seen as being complicit in the genocide of an entire population, the department needs to be well aware of how that's being read. Because believe it or not, there is a lot of disillusion in the department. I'll give you an example. When we had the parachute airdrops, it'd be like, oh, look, people are going to be so happy. Look, people are going to be so happy. We're sending all this humanitarian assistance.
Wait, that was the vibe within the department or within the government, that people were going to be so happy.
Yes.
I mean, that had the opposite effect.
Oh my goodness, Mohammed, I cannot tell you how many conversations that I had be like, I understand why you think this would make people in the region happy, but it is not. Hala, can't you go out on this? We're providing humanitarian assistance. Surely that should be an okay message for you to deliver. No, it's not, because we're also sending the bombs to kill these people. And these parachute airdrops are not actually a real means of staving off mass hunger.
Also, it was happening at a time when Israel was banning most aid trucks from actually going in.
Absolutely.
So I think a lot of people were looking at this as this was America's way of saving face, and it was just doing the bare minimum.
100%. Yes, and that's exactly the feedback that I was giving back to Washington, saying they see through this PR stunt. Everybody sees through this PR stunt. I will not be your PR machine to go and try to sell this PR stunt, because it's just a stunt. If we actually cared about warding off famine, we would put pressure on the Israelis to let the humanitarian aid trucks in by the hundreds. We are not using our diplomatic leverage. Until we use that diplomatic leverage, I will not be on TV trying to sell these things. But seeing people's legitimate confusion as to why the aid drops were not a good message to tell was very interesting. But that's why I'm telling you, like, there's also a sense like maybe people do need to tell you these basics that for us, the rest of the world sort of takes for granted. But when you are in the government, you're in this little isolated bubble and you're only hearing from other people in the government. And when you don't hear any of that critical feedback, you almost think everything is a success when it clearly is not.
You used the term genocide. So just to be clear on where you stand today. So do you believe that the US is complicit in this genocide?
Look, I'll give you a thorough response to this because it deserves it. I was still very much in government when South Africa brought its case against Israel at the ICJ. I actually previously served in South Africa. I'm familiar by name with all of the judges, and extremely professional and well-regarded, and I have the highest respect for all of those. So I read that report in detail, line by line, because I myself was trying to make the determination, because it was also going to impact my own resignation, right? Other than the fact that I really wanted to know what was happening in Gaza. It is impossible, I think, if you read that report with unbiased eyes, to make the determination that it is indeed genocide, based not just on their actions, but they're obviously on their intent. There are pages and pages of notes from Israeli officials, from prime minister on down, advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And this is on repeat. It's not just a one-off, it's on repeat. And obviously their policies, whether it be mass starvation or mass killings and destroying infrastructure to the point where people are dying of just very simple infections, it is very clear that it is a policy of ethnic cleansing and intended genocide. I don't believe that the US is trying to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. I think they are willfully enabling it, right? I think the United States government is definitely enabling it because we're supplying the weaponry. I don't think it's the intention of the government to commit it, but I think without us and our support, most specifically our military support, which has been unconditional practically, despite all of this evidence, is allowing Netanyahu's government to do what they're doing, which is their end goal is definitely ethnic cleansing. I do think Secretary Blinken and President Biden are trying to stop Israel from doing that. I want to still believe that, even though nothing in the policy. I know.
But just on that. No,
I know.
I think it's because there's a clear disconnect between what comes out of the White House and what Israel continues to do on the ground in Gaza. The latest being what's been called the Nusayrat massacre, right? And then there's the example of the ICJ ruling that there's a plausible genocide, yet the U.S. hasn't stopped sending weapons to Israel. Why should anyone trust that the U.S. government actually wants to end this genuinely?
Look, Mohammed, I completely agree with you in terms of actions have shown otherwise. And this is what I've been saying this past week in Washington, right? And I had conversations. I met with members of Congress, I met with congressional staffers, and I met with some senior State Department officials. And that's exactly what I told them, that people aren't necessarily blaming Israel, only Israel, for what's happening in Gaza, but they're blaming us. And we cannot get rid of our complicity by words alone, right? We can't say, there's only a certain amount of times that you can say we care about the Palestinian people, or we're trying to get humanitarian assistance without actually taking concrete actions, because we have leverage. Our biggest leverage is US weapons assistance and lethal assistance that we keep sending Israel. But I can tell you, Mohammed, that a lot of our foreign policy is not dictated by our foreign national or our national security interests. It's determined by domestic politics. And that was abundantly clear to me this past week in Washington as I was roaming the halls of Congress. These decisions are being made by politicians. And politicians are influenced by things other than national security. I'm just going to leave it at that, unless you want to dig into that.
No, I do. I want you to elaborate if you can.
So one of the deliberations that I had for myself as determining whether or not to resign is what is causing this intransigent policy? What is making us not shift or put condition on aid? When you have such a historic and strong, quote unquote, ironclad commitment to Israel, that comes from somewhere, right? Like the pro-Israel lobby in America is very, very strong. It's been part of Washington's DNA for decades, and there's been a lot of focus on that, right? I'm going to put some focus elsewhere as well, the arms industry. And that's something that we don't talk a lot about here in the Arab world. You hear a lot about AIPAC, you hear a lot about that, but there's also the arms industry. And from both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republicans, our politicians receive so many contributions, millions of dollars worth of contributions from the arms industry. And so when you have the politicians that are literally the ones making the decision of whether or not to send more arms, if they're profiting from that, how is this a fair shot? How is it a fair shot? If the politicians deciding whether or not to continue arms transfers are personally benefiting from those arms transfers. Again, as a diplomat, I was left to think, what the heck am I doing here?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean,
exactly. That made me also one of the many things that went through my mind and thought process in deciding to resign. I said, then literally, I'm just an implementer out here. There's no sense of me being here if, particularly on this policy, where there's so much influence on domestic politics that influences. And just now, from my conversations this last week with members of Congress, the ones that voted on a pause of shipment got so much pushback that they're scared now to take the same decision. They have campaign ads running against them. They have millions going against them if they take a stance on this. And it's a very problematic domestic politics issue that has immense impact on how we run our foreign policy in the United States.
But don't you think that Gaza is already becoming a domestic issue as well? Because it clearly will play a major part in November come the elections. So how do you end that cycle?
Overall, how you end that cycle is I think we need to have campaign finance reform laws in the US, which is obviously not going to happen anytime soon because it's not to the benefit of our lawmakers to make those laws. So you almost have, this vicious cycle. But when it comes to Gaza, 100%. And I think that this administration is vastly undermining how much this particular issue will affect the polls in November.
Do you still think that they are thinking that, even today?
Yes. From my time in Washington, everyone was saying, we get it. We get that Gaza's horrific, but the other option is Trump. And Trump is, So there's this assumption amongst Democrats that because Trump is so bad, that Americans, or at least Democrats, won't vote for Trump, that they'll forgive Biden on Gaza. And that's not true. That's not true.
Yeah. Because what about the uncommitted vote? What about, you've had people from the Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab community actually say that they hope Biden loses this election. So it's very clear that there are portions of American society that are calling, that, they're not going to forget about Gaza anytime soon, and surely they're not going to forgive Biden over Gaza anytime soon.
I completely agree with you. The uncommitted movement was very, very powerful, and it continues to be powerful, and it continues to grow in the United States. But because there's been so much institutionalized support for Israel, I think, and pro-Israeli congresspeople and senators, and obviously, all the way up to the president, I think there's this assumption that that side will win. So for Congressman Bowman in New York, I don't know if you've been following his race. He's been very, very forward-leaning and an advocate of a ceasefire. He's been very strong in condemning the Israeli actions as war crimes, so on and so forth. Like, he is being devoured and pounded by, pro AIPAC funds and all that to try to unseat him. So I think the assumption is, okay, well, when the time comes, we're going to just do a massive pro-Biden push and make sure he gets over the line. And I think for some, even for some that are very much in the pro-Israel camp, they're okay with both Biden or Trump, to be quite honest. But I think not so much for the other side, right? Because I think for the Democrats that felt that they were deceived by Biden, for the communities in Michigan, and I don't want to just say Arab and Muslim American communities, because really this has become a nationwide issue.
Sure,
when I was speaking to activists in Washington, and these are people that are leading protests and everything, they come from all different backgrounds, all faiths, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans. It really has become a humane issue, not an issue of a particular background. They're very staunchly against Biden. They want, like you said, they want to punish him. They want the Democratic Party to wake up. And I think as far as things stand now, unless the Biden administration really changes course dramatically on Gaza, I think they're going to see the vote to Trump. And the hope is that the Democratic Party will have an awakening, will realize that they cannot take the left for granted, that they cannot take liberal values like human rights, press freedom for granted, that when liberals say they believe in things like human rights and freedom of press and protection of journalists, they mean it, not just in words, but also in action. And so I hope that there will be an awakening on the Democratic Party side as a result.
Hannah, I want to read you a quote. This is by a former State Department official. So Aaron David Miller, he gave an interview to the New Yorker last April. He said this: "If you're asking me, do I think that Joe Biden has the same depth of feeling and empathy for the Palestinians of Gaza as he does for the Israelis? No, he doesn't, nor does he convey it. I don't think there's any doubt about that." Now, when you hear those words from a former State Department official, how do you react?
I agree with him completely.
How much of this do you actually think falls back to racism?
All of it. Look, this was another devastation that came out of this conflict. Colleagues, friends that I work with, forget about the senior officials in Washington, even just people that I worked with throughout my 18 years, not have the same emotional reaction to the killing of children in Gaza. And that for me was such an eye-opener and it was devastating. Why are you not shedding tears? How are you okay? I am not okay. I am not okay seeing all these children get killed in Gaza. How are you okay? Is this normal for you? It's almost this expectation that people in that part of the world, people in the Middle East, they just get killed all the time. There's just wars all the time. And so when I was telling you, I was sending those reports and I would send images of the dead children and I would get some feedback, but not the type of feedback that I would expect. I started to try to change my strategy. I said, okay, how can I humanize these children even more? And so then I would start putting images of them alive and the little girl,
Really?
the toddler wearing her princess dress. And I would even write commentary. I said, her name is Layla. You know, I'm making it up now, but obviously as an example, her name is Layla. Her favorite princess was Ariel. This is her pictured as Ariel. And this is her after the US bomb falls on her, thinking that maybe if they see these children alive, they would understand these are real kids. These are not numbers. These are not statistics. These are real children that are loved, that are beloved. Are you still okay enabling this policy? And unfortunately, the answer for most is yes. And to me, I think it does stem in a lot of racism. Why our policymakers are okay with it, but they're outraged by others getting killed.
But I actually want to stop right here. You know, for you to actually go to those lengths in order to talk about children that were being killed, I'm sorry, but I do want to invoke your identity here as an Arab American.
Absolutely.
How did that make you feel?
Horrified, to be quite frank. And like I said, this conflict has been so eye-opening on so many levels and so tragic on so many levels. You know, obviously seeing what's been happening in Gaza on a daily basis has been absolutely traumatic, and understanding and speaking to people that are there. And then the whole other layer of dealing with society, dealing with your coworkers and realizing it almost has shown me people's true colors, right? And I've been speaking to others who feel the same way, that this conflict has almost made them realize when you peel layers of people, you know, how are you really underneath? Do you really treat life equally? Do you really believe in human rights? Do you really advocate, you know, for the sanctity of life for children or not? Is it, and seeing that very blunt racism is also one of the reasons why I decided to resign. Like, how can I keep representing this administration? How? It wasn't possible for me anymore. And I've said this publicly in some TV interviews when I've been asked that I absolutely think it's racism. And I think that it is something that we have to deal with as a nation, right? The US has refused to deal with its past. And that has had so many implications. And this is one of them. This is sort of the latest iteration of that that's just been left to not address. And there's just some very embedded racism in the minds of people. It's subconscious, and I want to stress that, because people are like, okay, racism, well, aren't you more scared about Trump? And I'm like, you know, with Trump, you sort of know what you're going to get. But with the Democrats, it's supposed to be the party of liberalism. It's supposed to be the party of equality. But then you have all of this subconscious bias that actually is quite lethal and quite dangerous, because they don't even see their bias. So I had to point people's biases out to them. Do you see how differently you react to this child versus this child? And then they're almost shocked because they don't even realize it themselves.
I want to talk to you about the shifting public opinion towards Israel. There was a Gallup poll from last March that showed that 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military action in Gaza. Yeah, how do you think that this public opinion shift will affect the U.S. government's relationship with Israel in the future? Do you think it will?
I do think it will. I think it's shifting it now, but not enough, right? I think, you heard the president, it was, I guess, now a couple of weeks ago, come out publicly from the podium saying it's time for the war to end. Those were the first times he used those words. And I think he is feeling the public pressure. He is feeling all of the protests, these movements calling for an end and calling for a ceasefire. But clearly it has not been enough to make them take any substantive change in the policy. And so what I kept on articulating this last week is that we will not see a ceasefire until the US uses its leverage. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians, and I'm not going to say the Palestinians, actually Hamas, have any incentive right now to abide by a ceasefire that the US proposes, because we're not using our leverage. We've actually strengthened the far right in Israel, and we've given no incentive or leverage for Qatar or Egypt to use on Hamas. So it's embarrassing at this point that the president and the secretary keep using this rhetoric, assuming that it's going to change, but it's not. So yes, I do think it's going to have an impact, but not enough thus far.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned at the start of the interview. You talked about feeling that you were being treated differently because of your Arab American background. I mean, you were born in Morocco, correct, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What did you mean when you said that?
I was born in Morocco, very proud of my Moroccan heritage. But look, I have been told many, many times in my career, and many, many times in particular, since this conflict has started in Gaza, oh, as an Arab, or as an Arab American, or as an Arab woman, I'm sure you feel X, Y, and Z. No.
Right. They add a little asterisk to your identity, right? Yeah.
Not as this, not as that, as an American diplomat, right? I wouldn't say that to anyone else. I wouldn't say, oh, as this, you must feel this. No. And it's almost easier for people to dismiss what you're saying based on your Arabness, right? It's easier for them to dismiss facts if they're saying, oh, she must have a bias because she's originally from here, as opposed to actually looking at the facts. So like I said, everything that I documented was fact-based. It was analyzed, it was documented, and it was verifiable, because I wanted to be clear that this has nothing to do with my personal opinion. But even my opinion comes from my master's at Georgetown in Arab Studies, my double major in International Affairs and Middle Eastern Studies from George Washington, right? My assignment in Yemen, where I myself survived 3 terrorist attacks and was evacuated twice from Sana'a. My time leading a political economic section in Qatar, my time working in Egypt, my time working in the UAE, right? And living and working in these countries. So that's where my professional expertise came from. Those are where my recommendations came from. The fact that I worked on counterterrorism, on countering violent extremism, on human rights issues. But for some, it's much easier to ignore all of that and just dismiss you based on your heritage. And I was also very, very frustrating, and I actually complained that I was being treated that way, because fundamentally it's also not supposed to be who we aspire to be as Americans, right? We're supposed to be a nation of diverse backgrounds, and that's supposed to be what makes us stronger. But if we're being alienated because of that, I'm going to call you out on it.
When I hear you speak about your career and what you studied at Georgetown, and it sounds that you had such an idealized view of being an American diplomat. I'm curious, do you think about what your younger self, young Hala, who was about to graduate and go into public service, what you would have thought of your position that you're in now?
It's funny you say that, because I was just in Washington and I just walked by one of the dorms that I stayed at when I was a sophomore. And I was thinking, oh my God, look at that dorm. It looks exactly the same, but so much has passed between now and then. And who would have thought, that I'd be walking in the halls of Congress this week? Look, I'm going to be honest with you, Mohammed. When I joined the State Department out of Georgetown, I had a lot of friends call me a sellout, a lot. I had a lot of friends that were like, how could you join the government? What are you doing? I was also with those exact same friends at protests all the time. I used to go on the bus from DC to New York to protest I used to protest in front of the White House all the time. But I joined the State Department with this notion of, if you want to see change, be the change, right? Join the government and help make that change. And I actually received the fellowship to join the State Department. And the fellowship was meant to bring more diverse voices into government, more people of color into the government. And I believed in that because you need that. Our government needs that to be stronger. So I can say that despite everything that's happened, I'm still proud that I joined 18 years ago, but I'm also very much proud that I resigned because I never sold out, whatever that means, right? I stayed in for as long as I thought I could affect positive change. And then once I realized that that was no longer possible, I resigned, and I'm speaking out publicly because I feel like I have to. But you're right, I did have an idealized view. You know, some may call it naive. I think I still hold on to that, right? I still hold on to that because who wants that to be completely shattered? But
if you had a crystal ball, you don't think you would have chosen an alternative career path?
That's a really good question. I have to think about that because I don't like to believe in regrets, because I feel like every experience that you've had in life sort of forms the person you are. But I can tell you that actually I think I would have still joined, and I'll tell you why. Because this career has opened up my eyes in so many ways. I lived in Hong Kong for 2 years working as a consular officer. That taught me so much. I lived in South Africa, heading the political economic section. I was working in the US consulate in Durban. South Africa taught me so much about the world. It taught me so much about America, sort of race relations in South Africa, you know, and how history is also the present. You know, South Africans to this day cannot forget the US's role in apartheid and in supporting apartheid. They don't forgive it at all. So my job was actually very difficult in South Africa. Some people wouldn't even want to open the door for me because I was representing the US government. That was so eye-opening for me, so eye-opening, you know, and I obviously served in Yemen, which was an incredible experience. And then I went from Yemen to Hong Kong. So imagine living in Sana'a, one of the most impoverished cities in the world, and then moving to Hong Kong, which at that time was very wealthy and not all of the issues that it has today. So I'm so grateful that this career opened my eyes up to humanity, allowed me to see and understand the perspectives of so many around the world. And I think it made me who I am today, right? Because of all of that. And it was a privilege to be able to live and be immersed in all of these societies. I am able to, I think, have a more humane view of the world and understand that at the end of the day, we really are all the same. And so, yeah, even if I had a crystal ball, I think I would have still done what I did.
When you decided between yourself that you were going to resign, who was the first person you went to?
Oh, my husband, of course.
What was that conversation like?
Oh, he's wonderful. I'm so blessed to have such a wonderful husband. No, he's been supporting me throughout all of this, because especially when I was writing those daily reports, and I mentioned to you, Mohammed, they were quite tough to write. And, you know, I actually wanted to many times just stop and resign even before then. He's like, no, you know, you're making a difference. But then when he would see how much they would stress me out, he's like, okay, khalas, just like submit your resignation today. We'll figure out the finances, you know? No, so he's been my emotional support, and now my financial support since I'm currently unemployed. Right? So no, he's wonderful, and I hope everyone that is, you know, having.
Il est 8h32 et vous êtes bien sur RMC et BFM TV. Bonjour Mathilde Panot.
Bonjour.
Merci d'être dans ce studio pour répondre à mes questions. Vous êtes députée du Nouveau Front Populaire, LFI du Val-de-Marne. Vous avez d'ailleurs été réélue dès le premier tour. Et vous étiez, dans la précédente mandature, la présidente du groupe LFI à l'Assemblée. J'ai tout simplement une première question pour savoir si le président de la République vous a appelé. Est-ce qu'il vous a appelé, vous, Mathilde Panot, ou Manuel Bompard, ou Jean-Luc Mélenchon? Est-ce que vous avez eu des contacts avec le président de la République depuis dimanche?
Alors nous n'en avons pas eu, mais moi je le dis solennellement à votre micro aujourd'hui, Emmanuel Macron doit respecter le vote qui a eu lieu ce dimanche. Je me rappelle qu'avant ces élections législatives, lorsque partout on annonçait que l'extrême droite serait en tête à l'Assemblée nationale, eh bien tout le monde disait, puisqu'il y a eu une mobilisation civique exceptionnelle, alors le résultat serait incontestable. Donc je demande à Emmanuel Macron qu'il respecte le résultat des urnes, qu'il respecte que le nouveau Front populaire soit la